The last one we did of these was just before Pesach, and we did an amazing Pesach cooking webinar, including Sephardi cooking. So it's wonderful to be back. And tonight, of course, we're going to be talking about some very deep, interesting and heart-wrenching decisions that leaders have to make in life. So a big welcome to everyone around the world who's watching us. Please let us know in the chat where you're watching us from. If you're watching us on Instagram, on YouTube, on Zoom, or on Facebook, don't forget, you can always talk to us through the chat section of each of those platforms, or alternatively, if you're watching us on Zoom, don't forget there's a specific Q&A section as well that you can utilize. So a big welcome to everyone watching around the world. This is our 167th webinar. Hard to believe that approximately 4 years ago, when we began these at the start of COVID, we thought we'd do a one-off webinar, and that would be it, and we'd give people some medical advice about how to deal with COVID, and then they could go and get on with their lives. And who would have thought that 4 years later, having been watched now over 5 million times, that these webinars would have continued and been so successful. So our two largest webinars that we've done in the last few years, bizarrely, our webinar on ivermectin had more than 1 million people watching, and Douglas Murray 3 weeks ago has had more than 650,000 people watching us on YouTube. And a big welcome tonight to Gershon Baskin. Gershon, welcome. You've been hard to pin down, but it just shows you what determination actually does for you.
That's right. You have to be determined as if you're negotiating with Hamas.
You know, I think we couldn't have timed tonight's webinar any better, because we seem to be potentially on the verge of a breakthrough. But of course, we seem to be on the verge of a breakthrough every night.
No, it looks more like we're on the verge of a breakdown, not a breakthrough.
That is not good news. But so we always do pre-chat. We're going live in about 10 minutes. But as people join us, and we're broadcasting tonight on YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Zoom. So we have people spread, and we've had thousands and thousands of people who've already pre-registered for tonight's event. So you've got a massive audience. But I want to talk to you because we met for the first time about 12 years ago during your visit to South Africa. Is that your only visit to South Africa?
I've been to South Africa, I think, 3 times. I think 12 years ago, I was there with Limud.
Correct.
Right. So I've been there 2 other times besides that.
Holiday or work?
No, it was always connected to some conference or something, so someone else paid the way. I was there for a meeting of the World Movement for Democracy. That was in 2004.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I was there another time, I don't remember when.
So maybe you can give us some advice in the pre-chat, because we head to elections in South Africa in about 3.5 weeks. And for the first time since the dawn of democracy in South Africa, in our 30 years of democracy, it looks like no political party will win an outright majority when it comes to the elections. Now, you in Israel have had a lot of experience, maybe good and bad, in putting together... Mostly bad, but putting together coalitions is not an easy thing, and we've never really done this before on a national level before. Are there any principles, seeing you've been out and you've spoken and looked at our issues of democracy, are there any issues or principles that you would like to give us advice on and guidance of? Do you put together a coalition that works? Do you have to have specific interests and morals and principles that you agree on? You currently have a government in Israel that is extreme right and right. Does that work? And do you need the stability to govern, and you put anyone together, or do you have to share common values?
I think sharing common values is important. But I think you want to reflect as much as you can the majority of the society. Bringing in parties that are at the extremes makes the majority members of parliament hostage to those extremes. So I guess you want to avoid the extremes, but The city of Jerusalem right now, we had municipal elections last month, 2 months ago, all around the country. In the city of Jerusalem, the mayor Moshe Leon, created a wall-to-wall coalition. Every single party that got elected is in the coalition, which is, I guess, the ideal situation.
A
Because
national unity government.
national unity with everyone in it. No one was left out. All the parties were brought in, and they're all given part of the positions, the portfolios, the important committees. And that's probably the best situation to be in. Of course, Jerusalem, 40% of the residents of Jerusalem are not represented at all because they don't participate in the elections, the Palestinian residents of Jerusalem. But 60% of the residents of Jerusalem are Jewish, and all the factions were brought into a coalition. That I suppose is the best you can hope for. It also gives them out security politically to the mayor or to the prime minister.
So talk us through that, the 40% of people who do not participate. Is that of their own choice or volition? Are they denied the right to vote? Because Israeli Arab Palestinians within Israel generally do have the right to vote and are represented in parliament.
Right. The Palestinian residents of Jerusalem are citizens of the state of Israel. They're residents. Bizarrely, they are granted the status of residents on the basis of the law for entry the state of Israel. Although they didn't enter the state of Israel entered them. So they actually have a visa they don't have passports, they have a laissez-passer, an Israeli issued travel document. And as residents of the city of Jerusalem, this is a law we inherited from the British Mandate, they have the right to participate in municipal elections. But Palestinians don't recognize the annexation of East Jerusalem by Israel, which happened in 1967, and they have boycotted those elections since 1967. There was one election during the time of Teddy Kollek, where about 8% of the Palestinian residents of Jerusalem voted. This time, this year's elections were double what they were 5 years ago, and 2% of the people with the right to vote participated. But overall, they boycotted. It's a combination of boycott. It's a combination of fear, because people are threatened if they say they're going to participate, threatened by Palestinians. And Israel makes it very difficult for them to participate as well. They don't receive notices of where they're supposed to vote. Most people have never voted in their lives. So people have grown up and they could be in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and in their whole life they never voted anywhere. They don't know how to vote. They don't know where to go to vote. There are much fewer polling places per capita for Palestinians than there are for Jews in the city of Jerusalem. There are over 100,000 Palestinians who live beyond the separation wall, and there were 0 polling places beyond the separation wall, even though the Israelis could have put them at the crossing, in the post office at the crossing. It didn't happen. So there's a combination of Israel's not really interested in them participating, makes it difficult for them, and the Palestinian political leadership threatens them and says that they shouldn't vote. Most people are simply just not aware that it's election day. It's quite amazing.
Does anyone really care about issues on a local level in the middle of a war?
Well, yes, because local issues are very important. They have much more impact on people's daily lives than the national elections do. And there was an Arab Jewish party that ran in this past election. It was headed by a Palestinian young woman, a real idealist and amazing courage. She's an Israeli citizen. She's originally from Nazareth, but she's been living in Jerusalem for 15 years. And she decided to run, and she headed the list. And we did a lot of work to get her name out there. She got 3,000 votes, which was, she needed something like 5,700 or something like that to cross the threshold. And she didn't quite make it, but I've been working with her, and we're establishing a kind of a public bureau for Palestinians in East Jerusalem to have an address to go to when they have problems with the municipality. They could be problems in education and schooling, or sidewalks, or parking, or streets, or garbage collection, or building permits, or demolition orders, or all kinds of things. Palestinians who make up 40% of the residents of the city, really have no address, nowhere to go to. And they're often helpless. They don't know how to approach the municipality. They don't speak Hebrew, many of them. And so it's difficult. So we're hoping that Sundus El-Hut, the woman who ran for elections, is going to head this bureau. I just finished writing a fundraising proposal for her. And once she approves it, we're going to start raising money for it and hopefully open this bureau for the Palestinian public in Jerusalem to have an address to turn to. It will also be a period of 5 years where Sundus will have an opportunity to try and work with members of the city council and the legal advisor and the mayor and actually do a kind of internship, learn what it means to be a Jerusalem city councilor, because she was really never had any political experience. And this would be great for her and her colleagues if we manage to get this going.
Amazing. So we're going to go live in 2 minutes. Well,
Okay.
We're live already, but we're formally going to start. But Gershon, just so you understand our reach, we often ask people whether they're watching us on Zoom, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram, just to leave us a note and tell us where they are. So just, I don't know if you've seen in the chat section, but Sandra's watching us from Cape Town. We've got Nicola in the Cotswolds. We've got Susan in Toronto. We've got Noreen in Cape Town, Rochelle in Durban. We've got the Hurwitzes in Johannesburg. In San Diego, we've got Linda. We've got people in Johannesburg. In Miami, we've got Mervyn. Marcel, long message. I can't see where you're from. Jack Levy is busy watching us in London. Shirley is watching us in Delray Beach, Florida. In Constantia, we've got Cecil. In Milnerton in the Western Cape, we've got Hillary. I was just in the Western Cape. Yakov Kutsia is watching us in Port Elizabeth. We've got people in San Francisco. Lorraine's in San Francisco. We've got Mervyn and Eileen in Miami. Hi, Gershon, says Dylan Berger. This is Veronica Belling, Natanya's cousin in Cape Town.
Wonderful.
So I presume you know some of the Bellings. We've got Linda in Cape Town. We've got Jeff and Sue Miller in Cape Town. Shifra in Cape Town. In Beechwood, Ohio, we've got Barbara. Gary Rubin is also in Ohio. Oh, he's in Joburg. We've got people in Glen Hazel, Florida. So we've got an audience all over the world. And when we began this 167 webinars ago, thinking that we'd do one single webinar to help people through COVID and give them medical advice, never in our wildest dreams would we have imagined that we would be watched more than 5 million times around the world.
Amazing.
And when we look at some of the stats, we've got people who watch us. I see tonight we have people watching us in Ukraine. We have a group of people in Panama who watch us every time we do a broadcast. We've got people in Thailand, in the UAE. We've got people in Nigeria and Kenya. So somehow we've touched a nerve. And I think tonight's webinar has really touched an amazing nerve because our registrations have been unbelievable. So the time has just gone, South Africa time, 7 p.m. A big welcome to everyone around the world. Please drop us a note, no matter what platform you're watching us on. Please drop us a note and tell us where in the world you're watching us from. And please remember as well that this is a dialogue. It's not a monologue. Whether you're watching on YouTube, on Facebook, or Instagram, or on Zoom, please remember there's a chat function, there's a Q&A function, and Dylan is there tonight to bring all of your questions and your comments across, because we've got some really important questions to ask Gershon, and he's got an amazing story to tell us as well, which is probably now more relevant than ever before. So just before we begin, just a reminder that these webinars are brought to you by the South African Jewish Report. We distribute free of charge every Wednesday. The last 2 weeks have been Chagim, so we haven't had editions since Pesach, but our latest edition comes out this coming Wednesday. Dylan, show us what was in our Pesach edition. You probably won't be able to pick up a hard copy at the moment because we're probably distributed out around the country, but generally you can pick us up at Pick and Pays and Diskems and Checkers and your local supermarket, your local kosher restaurant. You can look for us at your school. You can look for us really in most shopping centers around the country where there's a Jewish population. We distribute in approximately 240 locations around the country. Of course, big news in South Africa. Coming up this coming week, there's a big, what they call anti-apartheid conference, an anti-Israel, anti-Zionist conference, which supposedly is going to be addressed by President Cyril Ramaphosa this coming week in Johannesburg. watch out for information in this coming week's edition of the Jewish Report newspaper, which will be distributed online on Wednesday evening. And of course, you can always go onto our website and download either the entire edition of the newspaper, or alternatively, if not the entire edition, you can click on the individual stories and you can find us on sajr.co.za. You can find us on the website at any point in time, and all of our old editions are available there on that website as well. Also, a reminder that all of our webinars are available both on YouTube, and if you want a short, easy access to them, on our website, sajr.co.za, just click on webinars and you'll be able to see some of the amazing webinars that we did. Gershon, we did a fantastic one on Sylvia, the Mossad spy who came from South Africa, watched hundreds and hundreds of thousands of times. Douglas Murray watched more than 650,000 times. So we've certainly had some amazing webinars, and we expect tonight to be equally popular as we go through. Also, our next webinar, we are now 2.5 weeks away, or 3.5 weeks away from our next elections. Our elections are on the 29th of May. And come Sunday, the 19th of May, we're going to be talking about what to expect from those elections. You can go and, in fact, register now. It's a bit.ly link, and it's bit.ly/JR Live 168, I think it is. Dylan, your controls are blocking the screen, but I think it's bit.ly 168. You can go and register. And tonight's broadcast is sponsored, thank you, by two companies who've been unbelievably generous in helping us pay for our Zoom licenses this evening. Of course, everyone involved in this is doing it free of charge, and a huge thank you to Gershon, who's given up his Sunday evening to spend with us as well. But let us show you two very quick adverts of our two sponsors tonight. Our first being Mantis Security, our second being Sky Fans. Let's show those adverts quickly, and then we're going to begin. Gershon, we've got a remarkable story to hear tonight, and some very important questions that we need to ask you. So a really big thank you to Mantis Security, who've been unbelievable in sponsoring so many of our webinars that we've done. We really appreciate the support. And now, for the first time tonight, we have a new sponsor that's come on board as well. And for the last 21 years, the guys from Sky Fans have been making unbelievable, unique, custom-made, handmade wooden fans. And the reason why they started this is they went to look for fans themselves, and they found that everything just looked absolutely exactly the same. The manufacturers couldn't find something that appealed to them and made sense to them. So they started their own business 21 years ago in order to manufacture these fans. Let's have a look at the guys from Sky Fans. And Dylan, if you could just put up all the details of Sky Fan, so if people need a Sky Fan for their home, please, if you could put in the chats on all our platforms, we'd really appreciate that. So Gershon, it's an interesting story, and it's a story that starts probably about nearly 20 years ago from our perspective. But before that story begins, let's understand who you are. I've heard you describe yourself as a peacenik. You're clearly born in America. The accent gives it away. You make Aliyah to Israel. You're clearly on the left of the spectrum. Tell us who you are and how you get to the story that we're going to tell this evening.
Okay, well, thank you, and good evening, everyone, from Jerusalem. I suppose my story of what I've been doing in my whole life begins when I was a youngster growing up in America in a very Jewish neighborhood, from a Jewish family, not a religious family, but a very Jewish identified family. At the end of the 1960s, I suppose we could say, I was born in 1956. Already from the age of 12, I was out demonstrating for civil rights and against the war in Vietnam. And to make this a very long story, very short, at the age of 14, my family moved from a very Jewish neighborhood to a very non-Jewish neighborhood. And it was the first time that I experienced not being a majority. There were only 3% Jews in the high school I went to. And in my first week in school, I met a young Jewish guy who had come back from Israel and was starting a chapter of a Zionist movement in our town, Young Judea, the largest Zionist movement that was in the United States. And he invited me to join. I didn't know much about it. I didn't know what Zionism was about. I had visited Israel for my bar mitzvah. That was something that I asked my parents for, and I don't really know where that comes from. But it was my impetus that brought us to Israel when I was 13. But here I was in high school, joining a Zionist youth movement, I think mainly because I thought it'd be a good place to meet Jewish girls. But I got very involved. It was very interesting. It was intellectually challenging. Within a year, I was elected to the regional executive board of the movement. By my last year in high school, I was the president of Long Island Young Judea. And sometime around that time, my general political outlook and the understanding that Israel was a land engaged in conflict with its Arab neighbors and had a question of the Palestinians who were living under Israeli control, I began to think about what that meant. I spent a year in Israel on the Young Judea year course, very intensive Zionist education program for a year, half a year on a kibbutz and half a year in Jerusalem, learning about Israel and thinking about my future. At that point, I already knew that Israel was my home and it was where the place I would end up. My parents sort of forced me to go back to America to at least do a BA at university, which I did. But during the time I was studying, I lived with members of the movement together. We shared a common house and all worked in the movement while we were students at the university. And in 1975, I think it was, I wrote my first op-ed article in a Jewish newspaper out of Berkeley, California, called The Jewish Radical. And the article called for Israel to recognize the right of the Palestinian people to establish a state of their own and for there to be a two-state solution. Now, in 1975, there were less than 2% of Israelis who thought that the solution should be a two-state solution, as we now call it. But it seemed to me to be quite evident because I learned that Israel was the democratic nation state of the Jewish people. And that meant something. It meant that Israel is built on two pillars, one being a Jewish state and one being a democratic state. And Israel occupying another people and denying their right to self-determination, the right that we demanded for ourselves, and clashed with the values of the two pillars of Israeli society. I started studying more and more about the Middle East, history and politics. And the more and more I developed my understanding of what the conflict was about, the more I encountered Israelis who, when I presented them with my opinions, told me that I didn't really have the right to talk, that I was a stupid, naive American. And people kept telling me, you don't know them. Them, of course, being the Arabs. Now, I was not aware enough or intelligent enough at the time to say, well, how do you know them? Because had I asked that question, I would have discovered that they didn't know them, but they thought that they did or could say that they did. I also went with two colleagues to meet with the PLO ambassador in the United Nations at the time in 1976. And not unexpectedly, when we appealed to him that the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, should recognize the state of Israel and support a two-state solution, he responded, over my dead body. You have no right to take our land. You should go back from where you came from, and you should let us live alone in our own land. That, as I said, was not unexpected. It was disappointing. But in my heart of hearts, I knew that a time would come when the Palestinians would recognize that their struggle against the existence of Israel is futile. Israel's not going away, and they would have to come to terms with Israel. That's what I believe then, and we'll get into more of what we've experienced over this last war a little bit into the discussion. But when I heard that, I understood that in order for me, one, to have credibility in the eyes of Israelis, I needed to have some experience which would afford me the ability to say, I know them and I know them better than you. And secondly, I needed to find something to do that would give me an entry point into political life in Israel as I moved there in 1978 at the age of 22 after finishing my BA. I'd initially thought that I would do a master's degree at the American University of Beirut, and I applied and got accepted, but the Civil War was going on and it was quite dangerous. And even I wasn't that crazy at that time. But I heard about a Reform rabbi who was a kind of radical guy who had done a lot of community work in Harlem, in New York City. And he had been in Israel at the time of the Land Day demonstrations in March of 1976, which time the first mass demonstrations of Israeli Arab citizens of Israel had demonstrated against land expropriations in the Galilee by the state of Israel. And at the end of that day of demonstrations, the Israeli police had killed 6 young Arab citizens of Israel. And since that time of 1976, every March 30th marks Land Day in Israel. Well, this rabbi, Bruce Cohen, decided that he was going to adopt community work principles to the Israeli Arab conflict, or to more correctly, to working on the issue of citizenship in Israel. At that time, there were 18% of the citizens of Israel were Arabs, Palestinian Arabs. 1 out of every 6 Israelis was an Arab. Today, it's 1 out of every 5. And he created a program called Interns for Peace, which recruited young American Jewish university graduates to move to Israel and to live in Arab villages for 2 years and engage in community work and building bridges to nearby Jewish communities. They had an office in New York City, not far from where I was studying at New York University. I went in, signed up, and I essentially made Aliyah to an Arab village in Israel. I spent 2 years living in this Arab village doing community work, learning so much more than I ever gave to the village. It was clearly a learning experience for me. One of the things that I learned when I was there was that the state of Israel, which called itself a democracy and preached equality, had in fact no one working at the governmental level to improve the relations between the Jewish and Arab citizens of the state of Israel. And at the time, Menachem Begin was prime minister, and I was thinking about what I was going to do when I finished my 2-year volunteers working in the Arab village. I wrote a letter to Prime Minister Begin, and I was actually invited to come to Jerusalem to the prime minister's office and spend a meeting with the advisor on Arab affairs to the prime minister. And it was at that time that I proposed to him to create a job for myself. And I actually, 14 months later, became the first civil servant in Israel responsible for Jewish-Arab relations. I worked in the Ministry of Education. I was just a kid, and I was given a high-level position with full access to the entire Ministry of Education. And I helped to create a department, a national education department for democracy and coexistence. And that was a state education committee that I was a member of. And through the ministry and the Prime Minister's office, I created the Institute for Education for Jewish-Arab Coexistence, which in 1981 was born, and I became its director. And it was a non-governmental organization, but it was affiliated directly with the Prime Minister's office and the Ministry of Education, which is kind of a precursor of most of the work that I've done throughout my life of finding the middle road between being independent and non-governmental while having government support, or at least not pissing off the government too much. So I actually had 4 board members on my board of directors, 2 from the Ministry of Education and 2 from the Prime Minister's office in this non-governmental organization, which allowed me to do the work that I started to do in the Ministry of Education, but I had money to do it with when it was funded by the German government through the Prime Minister's office. I did that work for 7 years. It was focused on building equality between the Jewish and Arab citizens of Israel. But in my heart of hearts, what I really wanted to do was engage in the cross-boundary work. But I remembered very clearly the words of the Palestinian ambassador in New York who said, "Over my dead body." But in the end of 1987, the first Intifada broke out. I won't go into all the details how it started, but the unified leadership of the Intifada, as it was called, began issuing leaflets, political statements, and declarations of actions that they wanted Palestinians to take. All of a sudden, after 20 years of Israel having conquered the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, the territories were inflamed with political action and protest and demonstrations, a lot of it nonviolence or small use of violence, mostly stones thrown by youngsters at Israeli soldiers. And they began issuing these political statements, and I began reading them. And it was a very different language than the language I heard of the PLO ambassador. And in March of 1988, 4 months into the first Intifada, I decided to go to the Dheisheh refugee camp south of Bethlehem, which is the largest refugee camp in the West Bank, just south of where I was living in South Jerusalem in Talpiot. So I got on my Vespa motorcycle and drove to the Dheisheh refugee camp one Saturday morning. And I got into the refugee camp, into the school parking lot. It was a United Nations school. I took off my helmet, and immediately these young people approached me and said, "Who are you and what are you doing?" And in my broken Arabic, I explained to them that I'm an Israeli and I came to listen. I want to understand what this Intifada is, what you're fighting for, what's it all about. And we stood in the parking lot for about 20 minutes talking, and then someone said, "Yalla, come to my house." And I walked into the refugee camp with these young people, went into a home, and about 30 people gathered into a crowded one-room house. And I spent 6 hours there that day. When I left the camp, I was buzzing with energy because after 6 hours of talking to all these young people, not one of them said to me what the PLO ambassador said: "You have no right to be here." What they said was, Israel needs to end its occupation over the lands it conquered in 67 and allow us to have an independent state. We'll live in peace next to you. And that was really new. That was revolutionary. So I got home and I wrote a letter of resignation to my board of directors. The next week, I went to East Jerusalem and published an advertisement in 3 Palestinian newspapers, which said, "If you believe in the two-state solution, you believe that Palestinians and Israelis can work together, you're curious about this ad, give me a call." I left my phone number. Here's cultural ignorance. I published the advertisements on a Friday in the newspaper, because in Israel, Friday is the day when most Israelis buy newspapers. Even people who don't read it during the week, on Friday buy a newspaper. In Palestine, it's exactly the opposite. It's the day when the least number of newspapers are sold. Cultural unawareness. But nonetheless, by Saturday night, I received 63 phone calls. I scheduled appointments with anyone who was willing to talk to me. During the next week, I took a table in the American Colony Hotel courtyard and met with 23 people. I prepared a 1.5-page paper which said the Israeli-Palestinian conflict used to be existential. It was either us or you. Now it's a conflict about issues. And I suggested that there were 7 issues in conflict: the issue of Palestinian statehood and the nature of its sovereignty, the borders between the 2 states, the future of Jerusalem, the issue of Palestinian refugees, the physical connection between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the nature of economic relations, and the question of water. And what I said is, these are the issues in conflict. In order to have peace, we have to resolve all of these issues. If we resolve 6 and leave 1 unresolved, Jerusalem, refugees, what it is, there's no peace. It's a package deal. Then I proposed that the best way to go about this is to create a joint Israeli-Palestinian institution where we're working together, side by side, shoulder to shoulder in the same office, organizing working groups of professionals where the starting point for the discussions is the acceptance of the two-state solution. Then we figure out how to do it. So over the next 24 years, where I co-directed this institution, ICREE, the Israel-Palestine Center for Research and Information, we ran more than 2,000 working groups of Israeli and Palestinian professionals on every question concerning the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. I also had the opportunity during that period of time to become an advisor to a team of intelligence officers to Yitzhak Rabin on the peace process. I was a member of the experts committee under Prime Minister Barak on the future of Jerusalem before the talks that took place in Taba in January of 2001. And of course, later I opened up a secret backchannel to Hamas, which led to the negotiations that eventually led to the breakthrough, bringing Gilad Shalit home from captivity after 5 years and 4 months. That's the big story. I spent 6 years after I left ICREE trying to bring commercial scale solar energy to Palestine, spent more than $500,000 and really didn't succeed because of the dysfunctional nature of Palestinian governance. And over the last couple of years, I've been working under the hat of a British non-governmental organization called International Communities Organization that works in conflict zones with failed peace processes. So I found my place. And this is the mother of all conflicts and the mother of all failures. And that's what I've been doing over the last couple of years.
You shouldn't feel bad because my master's degree is in international conflict resolution, and I was taught by someone called Herb Kalman, who was
I
one
know
of the
Herb Kalman,
absolutely one of the great experts. And he started his first lecture by saying, "I've devoted my life to solving two problems: the Cyprus problem, the Israeli-Palestinian problem." You can see how successful I've been in life.
Yes. Well, I haven't given up yet, and Herb did it to his last day, and of course it's sad that he passed away. But there is an institute that continues his work on his name.
So, Gershon, because of who you are and because of the contacts you have and the work that you did, it placed you in a very unique position to have contacts, international contacts, which the average Israeli and even the Israeli government didn't have. You were able to reach across to people like Hamas. Tell us how your relationship with individuals in Hamas originally began.
Well, the story begins with actually a very sad beginning. In September of 2005, one of my wife's first cousins was kidnapped and killed by Hamas. My wife comes from an Iraqi family. She had 36 first cousins. I come from a good Ashkenazi family of 2 first cousins. So the difference between our 2 families. But Sasson Noriel was one of my wife's first cousins, who she basically grew up with in Netanya at the time. And he had a candy factory outside of Jerusalem. And the short story is that he had a Palestinian worker who we went home with one day because there was a factory in Ramallah, presumably, that had gone bankrupt and the equipment was for sale. And Sasson went home with him and never came back. I was attending a conference that I organized in Switzerland at the time on the future of Jerusalem. My wife called me and told me that Sasson was missing, and the family wanted to know if I could use my contacts to see if we can locate him. I called my Palestinian partner in Jerusalem, who went to Ramallah and looked for him and didn't find him. A few days later, Hamas published a video of Sasson, who had been tortured. He was Iraqi Jew, spoke Arabic, and he, in Arabic, said that if Israel released Palestinian prisoners in exchange for his life, he would be freed. And I guess the terrorist knew that the Israeli security were on their trail, and they killed him with a butcher's knife and threw his body on the side of the road. At Sasson's funeral, attended by over 1,000 people in Jerusalem, I stood over his grave crying like everyone else, and swore to myself that if ever again something like this happened, I would do everything humanly possible to save a human life. Fast forward, in the beginning of 2006, Palestinians had parliamentary elections, and Hamas won those elections. And the reality of the existence of Hamas was very clear. I'd been working with Palestinians for more than 20 years, never met anyone from Hamas. I was attending a conference soon afterwards in Cairo, a World Bank conference on Eastern Mediterranean economic development. And at the conference, a Palestinian economist from the Fatah University in Gaza approached me with someone else and said, "Gershon, I want you to meet my colleague. He's a professor at the Islamic University in Gaza, professor of economics, and he was a student of mine in the past, and he's a member of Hamas. And he came from Gaza to Cairo because he had heard that maybe there'd be some Israeli Jews here. He'd never met a Jew before. I'd never met anyone from Hamas before. During the next 2 days, we spent about 6 hours in dialogue. It reminded me very much of the conversation that we had with the PLO ambassador back in 1975. It was like a non-starter. There was nothing that we agreed on. But at the end of the conference, I proposed to his name was Professor Mohammed Migdad. I proposed to Professor Migdad that this discussion was interesting and we should keep going at it. And I proposed to him that he put together a group of his colleagues and I would put together a group of Israelis. I told him that I would find some country that would host us. That was a challenge, but I found 4 countries that were willing to host us. And the first country was actually Russia, had the most appealing invitation to us. And the Russians asked me to get copies of the passports from the people from Hamas in Gaza so they could prepare their visas. And I contacted Professor Migdad, and he told me, okay, he would send them. And I waited a day, 2 days, a week, 2 weeks, and they didn't come. And he told me they have a problem. People are scared. So I went down to Gaza. We could still go to Gaza at that time. I also have a press card, which enabled me to enter Gaza. And I met with him and his colleagues at the university. And they said that if they didn't have a clearance from the political leadership of Hamas, they couldn't attend. So we got in Professor Migdad's car. We drove to the Hamas's prime minister's office. Here I am, an Israeli, have to show them my ID as I enter the prime minister's office, Ismail Haniya, and they look at my ID and give it back to me and say, welcome. And we spent 2 hours with one of the political advisors to the Hamas prime minister, a man named Dr. Ahmed Youssef. And at the end of our 2-hour conversation, Ahmed Youssef said he would join the group. So I left Gaza that day thinking, voila, this is going to happen. We're going to have this dialogue. And then I waited a day and 2 days and a week and 2 weeks, and they didn't come. And Professor Migdad told me that the Hamas leadership outside in Damascus, Khalid Mashal, had put a veto on this. But nonetheless, I invited Professor Migdad to attend an Israeli-Palestinian meeting I organized in Istanbul, and we arranged for him to fly to Istanbul. And it was first time participating in a meeting like this. June 25th or 26th, I don't remember the date now, there's a cross-border attack on the Kerem Shalom army base. 2 Israeli soldiers are killed, another is abducted. Took an hour before the army even knew they were missing a soldier. Gilad Shalit was taken off into Gaza. Israel began a military operation called Summer Rains, where they bombed the electric plant, they bombed roads and bridges, basically to try and prevent from Hamas to take him out of Gaza. And a week later, on July 1st, 2006, Professor Migdad called me early in the morning and said, Gershon, we have to do something. This is really terrible. We're being bombed. We have no electricity, no water. I said to him, what can we do? He said, let's try to open up a channel of communication. He drove to the prime minister's office. They called me. Later that day, I arranged a phone call between Noam Shalit, Gilad Shalit's father, and one of the Hamas leaders. And that began my engagement in negotiations. The next day, the Shalit family came to Jerusalem, and I said to them, to Noam and Aviva Shalit, that I would be with them until the day that Gilad returns home. A few days later, we have a cross-boundary attack on the Lebanese border, and 2 Israelis are abducted into Lebanon. We have a war going on in the north, a war going on in the south. Ehud Olmert is prime minister. He wouldn't talk to me. I called his daughter and asked if she would be a conduit for delivering messages from Hamas to the prime minister, and she agreed. So I had a network set up of talking to Hamas, having a way to deliver messages to the prime minister. In short, I knew that no one would take me seriously unless I had a proof of life of Gilad Shalit. And so that's what I worked on.
At that point in time, did people know if Shalit was alive or dead at that point?
What the prime minister said, and the messages I got from his daughter, was that we know that Shalit is alive, and we hold Hamas and Mahmoud Abbas responsible for him. I'd gone to Mahmoud Abbas and had them help negotiate because Hamas wanted to receive all the women and teenage prisoners in Israel in exchange for a videotape of Gilad Shalit. That was 350 women and teenagers at the time, and Olmert refused to pay anything for information, said, we know that he's alive. And I said, great, you may know that he's alive, but we don't know if we have a channel of communication that leads to the people who are holding him. Also, during the first 50 days after Shalit was abducted, there was actually no one in charge of the file. There was no one in the position of coordinator of missing people in the Israeli Ministry of Defense. Only 50 days later, Olmert appointed someone. So I was basically working on my own. When I understood that a videotape wasn't going to go because Olmert, even when we reduced the number to 50 women and teenage prisoners, Olmert refused. I went back down to Gaza and I met with Ghazi Hamad, who was the spokesperson of the government and advisor to the prime minister. And I suggested to Ghazi Hamad that we forget the videotape and they should give me a handwritten letter from Gilad Shalit in exchange for nothing. And he said, why for nothing? And I said, because it'll open up negotiations. And he liked the idea. He told me to wait in Gaza. I wait in Gaza for the day. I went and spent about 3 hours at some restaurant in Gaza waiting for him. 3 hours later, he came back to me saying they liked the idea. I thought I might leave Gaza that day with a letter. Instead, I went back when it started getting dark. And I waited a day and 2 days and a week and 2 weeks and nothing came. And every day I called Ghazi Hamad, said, where is it? Where is it? Where is it? It took 2.5 months from the date that Shalit was abducted till we received notification that a handwritten letter was delivered to the Egyptians in Gaza. And the next day came to Israel. It was proof that it was real and it was Gilad Shalit's handwriting. And lo and behold, we had proof that he was alive and we had a channel of communication. And I began delivering messages. And then I got a request, basically an order from the person in charge now, the former deputy head of the Shin Bet, who told me to cease my activities because the Egyptians were taking over and the Egyptians didn't want any back channels. That was fine. I was in contact with the Egyptian intelligence. And they actually told me to keep my finger on the pulse and see what information I could get. But they started negotiating in December of 2006. 6 months after Gilad Shalit was abducted, the Egyptians put down on the table a proposal for the release of 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for Gilad Shalit, 450 from a list made by Hamas and 550 from a list made by Israel. 5 years later, that was the deal. It took another 5 years before Israel and Hamas were ready to materialize the deal. But over those 5 years, I stayed in touch with Hamas, and Netanyahu took over, and he had a person conducting negotiations. They brought in a German intelligence chief to handle those negotiations. In July of 2010, I received a fax from the chief of staff of the Hamas army saying that they were willing to renew negotiations based on the work that the German negotiator had done. The German had been thrown out of Gaza and told never to return by Hamas. And for more than a year, there were no negotiations going on when the Israeli statement was, we're waiting for a response from Hamas. This is a statement that I hear these days, and it just drives me crazy. But in April of 2011, Netanyahu appointed a new man to be in charge of the file, someone who was an acting Mossad officer. I got his phone number. I contacted him. I told him about myself. 3 weeks later, I was delivering...
Sorry, to interrupt. How on earth do you get hold of someone from the Mossad?
His name was published. His name was David Meidan. I had known when I was on Ehud Barak, Prime Minister Barak's expert committee on Jerusalem in preparations for the negotiations in Taba in January of 2001, the political advisor to Ehud Barak was a man named Pini Meidan, and Pini had been a Mossad officer. So, and I worked directly with Pini Meidan. I called him. I said, Pini, is David Meidan a relative? He said, no. I said, he asked me why. I said, Gilad Shalit stuff. He had known that I had been doing things behind the scenes to free Gilad Shalit. And he said, you want me to talk to David for you? And I said, yes, please do. He did. And an hour or two later, David Meidan called me. Now, that was it. It was very simple. Basically, this is a small country and everyone knows anyone. I can get the phone number of virtually anyone in this country in a very short period of time. And I have in my telephone here, I think over 7,000 phone numbers of various people from Israel and around the world. So it's not, that's the easy part. The more difficult part is to get them to listen to you or want to listen to you. Anyway, from May of 2011 until the end of July 2011, I was the primary channel. For the first time, Israel and Hamas were conducting direct negotiations between me and Ghazi Hamid as my counterpart, my interlocutor in Hamas, Ahmed Jabri, the head of their military forces, the person responsible for holding Shalit, and David Meidan, who had received approval from Netanyahu to run the secret back channel on the condition that it remains secret. And that's what led to the breakthrough, which was taken to Netanyahu in July of 2011, at which point from August or the end of August, the negotiations moved to Cairo under the auspices of the Egyptian intelligence, and the deal was finished. And in October 2011, Gilad Shalit came home, and Israel released 1,027 prisoners. The agreement was for 1,000, but one of the principles that we had agreed on was that all the women prisoners would be released. And don't ask me how, but 2 days before the deal was implemented, they discovered another 27 women prisoners. Well, I don't know how you lose 27 women prisoners, but it was decided that rather than trying to renegotiate the deal, Israel would just release them also. So the number became 1,027. One of them, the most notorious of them, was Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas.
So I want to get on to the price for the exchange. Sure. But before I do that, I want to talk about almost the holy bond between a soldier and their nation. And what is it that allows a soldier to go to war? Is there an understanding that the state will do anything to get that soldier back? Is that part of the deal?
That was one of the ethos of Israeli society. I'm not sure that it still exists in light of our reality that we're living now. But it was certainly part of the core of what Israeli society is about, and it is what enabled us to at least believe that we have a people's army, that we all serve in principle, that we send our children, our brothers, our sisters to serve in the army. I think that is when Netanyahu made that deal and 26 members of his government voted for it, and the head of the Mossad, the head of the Shin Bet, the chief of police, the chief of staff of the army, all recommended to the Israeli government to vote for it. Only 3 ministers voted against. 26 ministers voted for the deal. That was a moment of greatness, I believe, in Israeli society, because we acted on that ethos, on that principle that we don't leave anyone behind. And I wrote a letter of congratulations to Netanyahu on making that deal. And I wrote to him in the letter that leadership is not when a leader makes easy decisions. Leadership is when you make a decision that is diametrically opposed to the values that you hold. And Netanyahu literally wrote the book that we don't negotiate with terrorists. Literally, he wrote the book. And he had to negotiate between these values on the scale of not negotiating with terrorists and not leaving anyone behind. And he essentially ruled against himself. And that was a leadership decision. I think it was motivated by a lot of other things. And we know in hindsight, or I know in hindsight, that one of the deciding factors in that decision made by him was that his wife told him to bring him home. The Shalit family held their Pesach Seder on the street in front of the Prime Minister's office. And as the story was told to me by David Meidan, Sarah Netanyahu looked outside the window, saw them sitting on the street. It was a very sad scene. My family had gone to them before our own Seder to wish them well and hope for Gilad to come home. And Sarah simply turned to Bibi and said, bring him home. And that was enough to convince Netanyahu. When David Meidan took the position during Chol HaMoed Pesach in 2011, David Meidan, who was a very important Mossad officer, said to him, listen, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm willing to take the job, but I want to know what the mandate is. And I want to know that I have freedom to act. And Bibi said, your mandate is to bring him home. That was it. He wasn't given any red lines. He wasn't given any restrictions. He wasn't told what he's not allowed to say. Netanyahu simply said to him, bring him home. And that's what David Meidan did.
So he comes home. It's taken nearly 5.5 years to bring him home. Before we go on to the issues of the price, it does have public support as well. It's not just political support.
Almost 80% of the public supported it. Almost 80%, which is remarkable because now if you do surveys and ask people who are of the age, did you support the Shalit deal? You'll get less than 50% of people who will say they supported it. But in real time, it was almost 80%.
And tell us a little about him coming home, about Gilad Shalit himself, and then we're going to go and talk about the price for the deal.
Look, there was a whole festival in Israel of Gilad Shalit coming home, and everyone was watching it. You know, when David Meidan, I met him face to face for the first time, and he had been approached by a lot of different people with different motivations for doing what they were doing. He asked me, what do you want? And I said, I don't want anything. I want to help bring Gilad Shalit home. He said, but really, money, what is it you want? I said, listen, David, I have one request. I would like to be at the border when Gilad Shalit crosses over. And on the morning of October 18th, when Gilad Shalit came home, David Meidan called me early in the morning and said to me, Gershon, I'm really sorry. Bibi said no. It was just so common, so Netanyahu. He wanted to be the limelight, the focus point, and didn't want anyone there to overshadow him in any way. You saw the pictures, David Meidan was way in the back. No one even noticed David Meidan. He was the guy who was responsible. but Bibi was there taking all the credit. Anyway, Gilad Shalit, there was a festival. I mean, the news people, the paparazzi were camped outside of his house. He lives in a small village way up on the Lebanese border. And every movement of Gilad, he went outside of his house. He went on a bicycle ride. He took a walk in the forest with his father. Everything was being reported. And I stayed away. After 3 weeks, the media attention went away, and I contacted the Shalit family and said I wanted to come and visit. My wife and I went to visit him. Gilad was emaciated. He was very pale. He could barely still open up his eyes. He had gone for a very long surgery. He had 8 pieces of shrapnel embedded into his arm that he was wounded, and it was never really treated. He had lost use in 2 of his fingers from the shrapnel wounds. He had gone for a very long dental appointment. He hadn't seen a dentist in 5 years and 5.5 years. So he did not look well, but I saw him, and we continued to communicate. I arranged to meet him a couple of months later, took him for lunch in Tel Aviv. By this time, he was already more back to himself. And I heard a lot of the stories of what he went through, all the kinds of things that were never published. And one of the things that the people who advised Gilad told him was, you don't run to the press, don't tell your story, keep it to yourself. You want to look at the future. You don't want to keep reliving the past. And Gilad he was a very private person. He was very introverted. He survived with enormous amount of, I don't know how to put it, inner strength. He's a very quiet person, and he's not very extroverted. He doesn't really need a lot of people. His biggest problem was loneliness and the lack of knowledge of what was happening with him. He had a radio for most of the time he was in captivity, so he heard the news. He heard every day how many days he was in captivity. He had hopes when they were talking about a possible agreement, and then those hopes dissipated as there was no agreement. That was very hard for him. He was in 3 different locations most of the time, although sometimes he was moved from place to place. He was in a house underneath a family in a kind of basement for more than 1.5 years. He heard the noise of children above him. He didn't see sunlight except for the last week in captivity. And in fact, in his last month in captivity, he couldn't digest his food from acute vitamin D deficiency. On the helicopter ride from the Rafah crossing to the army base that he was taken to, it should have been a 10-15-minute helicopter ride. They actually stayed in the air for almost an hour because he actually physically collapsed. They had to give him adrenaline and intravenous, and they had to revive him. He had this big adrenaline drive when he was released. But for 5 years and 4 months, the Israelis never knew where he was in Israel's backyard. Even on the day that he was released, there were 30 identical cars that left center of Rafah toward the Rafah crossing, and Gilad Shalit wasn't in any of those cars. He was in another vehicle taken on another route, in the vehicle with Ahmed Jabri, the head of the Hamas military force. I've stayed in contact with Gilad over the years. I was at his wedding. I was at his father's funeral. I contacted him several times at the beginning of this war because his name was being brought up all the time as if he's responsible for what happened on October 7th. And I said to him, Gilad, always remember that you were a victim. It was called the Shalit deal, but you had nothing to do with it. You bear no responsibility for the decisions of the government of Israel or anything that happened with regard to your release. You were a victim. You were abducted from an army base and you were held in captivity for 5 years and 4 months. Remember that you were a victim and you're not responsible. And he appreciated that message. And he did meet with some of the families of hostages. He volunteered to meet with them, tried to encourage them, told a little bit about his own captivity and the way that he was treated, and thought that that might give their families some hope. But basically, he's a very private citizen, and we hear his name still often, but we don't really see him or hear him.
So Gershon, let's talk about the price, 1,027 prisoners, of whom one was Yahya Sinwar.
Right.
In retrospect, was it a good deal? There was an enormous price paid by Israel, And obviously the attacks of 7th of October having been orchestrated and masterminded by Yahya Sinwar, one of the 1,027 people who was released, obviously has had a devastating effect on Israel. When you look back retrospectively, are there regrets?
I don't have any regrets, but let me put something into context for a moment. The 450 prisoners who were released from the Hamas list included about 300 people who had murdered Israelis, including 4 who were responsible for murdering my wife's first cousin. They were released in the deal. The negotiations that I took part in were aimed at the principles of the deal and focused mainly on mitigating the risks to Israel. And I acted on Israeli Mossad instructions demands. The 25, first of all, there was a list of 50 of the most dangerous prisoners on a list. In the end, the agreement that I reached with Hamas was that we would compromise in the middle, and 25 of them would be released, and they would all be deported outside of Israel and Palestine forever, never allowed to come back. That was thought to mitigate the risk. Israel wanted the majority, or if not all, the West Bank prisoners to be sent to Gaza. In the end, the deal that we arrived at was that 50% -1 of the West Bank prisoners would be sent to Gaza, so that Hamas could claim that a majority of West Bank prisoners were allowed to go to their homes in the West Bank. The decision was that the Israelis wanted to remove as many of these people from the West Bank as possible, thinking in Gaza they would be less of a risk. Of the 300 murderers of Israelis who were released in the deal, Yahya Sinwar was not one of them, because Yahya Sinwar never murdered an Israeli. He had murdered Palestinian collaborators or people suspected of being collaborators with Israel. He wasn't even in the list of the most dangerous people. The Israeli security didn't think that he was a dangerous prisoner because he had never killed an Israeli. So he wasn't even one that they limited. There were about 8 or 10 names who were removed from the list by Israel. Israel simply refused to release them and would not even negotiate with the people who were considered the most dangerous and the ones who had murdered the most amount of Israelis. Yahya Sinwar was not one of them. In fact, I'll get to that in a moment. There was no other deal possible to bring Gilad Shalit home. And another month in captivity, Gilad Shalit would have been dead from malnutrition because he couldn't absorb the food that he was eating anymore. And that would have destroyed what we believe is part of our society, that we don't leave anyone home. Hamas knew it as well. Gilad Shalit had value as long as he was alive. A dead Gilad Shalit wouldn't be valuable to them. And there was an opportunity. The stars had aligned because there were new people in all the security positions in Israel. Netanyahu had made the decision to bring him home. Hamas was ready to make this deal. They had made compromises like exiling terrorists and sending terrorists to Gaza. And it had to be done. I had nothing to do with the selections of the names, and I'm not avoiding responsibility here. I'm quite proud of the role that I played in bringing Gilad Shalit home. I think it was an essential part of who we are as a people, that we brought Gilad Shalit home. The failure is not the deal that was made with Hamas. The failure is that we didn't exploit the opportunities that existed when there was no longer an Israeli soldier captive in Gaza to change the reality on the ground. And believe me, in 2012 and 2013, I tried to create a secret Backchannel between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Mahmoud Abbas. And 3 times I carried offers from President Abbas to Netanyahu to open up a secret direct Backchannel. I brought David Meidan, the Mossad officer, to meet a senior advisor of Mahmoud Abbas, and we spent 3 hours together in the King David Hotel talking about a possible Backchannel, but Netanyahu rejected it. Netanyahu developed a strategy in 2009 that he would keep the Hamas leadership, the Palestinian leadership separated between Gaza and the West Bank. He would prevent any kind of realliance of these 2 political bodies into one. When there was a national unity government, Netanyahu refused to recognize it or deal with it, even though there were no Hamas members of the government. And Netanyahu systematically delegitimized the Palestinian Authority, refused to negotiate with them, with Mahmoud Abbas, and kept Hamas in power, even brought about funding from Qatar to Hamas in order to say, we want peace, but they don't. We have no partner. Who do you want us to negotiate with? This was Netanyahu's strategy from 2009, and it blew up in our faces on October 7th, when suddenly we should have realized that you cannot occupy another people who want freedom and liberation for 56 years and expect to have peace, or lock more than 2 million people in a territory like Gaza with almost 80% poverty and expect to have quiet. And all the opportunities that were there over the years to change the reality on the ground in Gaza, to remove the economic siege on Gaza, to allow people freedom of movement, not allowing weapons to go in. They brought in weapons without our permission, with a siege going on there. They brought in weapons, but we had an opportunity to change the reality of 2.2 million people in Gaza. We had an opportunity to negotiate a two-state solution with Mahmoud Abbas, and we didn't. Israel was so convinced from Netanyahu that we can manage this conflict that in 4 rounds of consecutive elections, the Palestinian issue wasn't even mentioned. And then Trump came along and allowed us to make peace with some Arab countries while ignoring the Palestinian issue. I'll tell you, during the time when Bougie Herzog, Yitzhak Herzog, our current president, was head of the Labor Party, I convinced Herzog to enter into secret negotiations with Mahmoud Abbas. And even when the government failed and we went to elections, Bougie allowed those negotiations to go on. Ephraim Snare, former Deputy Minister of Defense, former minister in labor governments, was the negotiator on behalf of Herzog. And Mahmoud Habbash, the Chief Justice of the Sharia Supreme Court in Palestine, was the representative of Abbas. And 3 weeks before elections, they arrived at an agreement that was accepted by Herzog and Abbas. And from the home of Mahmoud Habbash in Ramallah, 3 weeks before the elections, I called Herzog and said, Mahmoud Abbas is willing to do a joint press conference with you and announce to the world that you reached an agreement. And if you win the elections and become prime minister, you will move forward to detailed negotiations to materialize a two-state solution. And Herzog, on the advice of his advisors, who told him the Israeli people don't want to hear about the Palestinian issue, told me to tell Mahmoud Abbas that he should shut up. In those words, that's what he told me. And I claimed to Bougie Herzog, I said to him, Bougie, you can't beat Netanyahu by being more Netanyahu than Netanyahu. The only way you're going to win these elections if you show the Israeli people that there's hope of peace. And he chose to listen to his advisors and not to me. And he lost those elections because people wanted the real thing. They didn't want a cheap copy. They voted for Netanyahu again. Oh, this has been our story. So it wasn't the deal with Hamas for Gilad Shalit that led to October 7th. It was the fact that the occupation continued and deepened, and the separation and siege on Gaza became harsher and harsher. 68% youth unemployment, 7 working universities in Gaza with graduates who had no future, no place to go, and no hope. What did we expect was going to happen?
So let's talk about the 7th of October. Did it surprise you when it happened? Or do you think this was inevitable?
I think it was inevitable, and it surprised me. I had written a month before that I was expecting an explosion, but I thought it was going to come from the West Bank. I didn't expect it to come from Gaza. When I looked back at communications that I had with my Hamas interlocutors before October 7th, there were all kinds of hints there that I didn't see, that something was changing. I had spent 2 years trying to convince one of the Hamas leaders to spend a few days with me in an Airbnb that we would take in Norway or in Switzerland and brainstorm on how to break the deadlock. And he had actually agreed at one point, and then the whole visa issue got screwed up and he got cold feet. But I continued to suggest to him, to avoid the problem of visas, that we simply go to Cairo. I would take an Airbnb somewhere in Cairo. It's a city of 20 million people. No one would know that we're there and meeting. And at one point, several months before October, he said to me, for the first time in all the years that I've been talking to him, he said, I can't. He never said to me, I can't. I can't talk to you. I can't meet with you. And in hindsight, I read it back and understood that something, in real time, I didn't understand that something had changed. He was part of the planning. He actually had left Gaza. This is Ghazi Hamid. He left Gaza before the war, and he was sent to Beirut to be the spokesperson for the war in the beginning of the war until he screwed up in that famous interview that he gave on Lebanese television, in which he swore that they would do October 7th over and over and over again. But until that time, he was my primary interlocutor in Hamas. So yeah, I was surprised. I was surprised at the brutality, at the atrocities, at the murder, of the dimensions of the attack that took place, of the hatred, of the inhuman behavior. And I wrote immediately after that Hamas lost its right to govern in Gaza. Hamas crossed the line between humanity and what's on the other side, and they no longer have the right to govern their own people. That was my sense at the beginning of the war. It's what I believe till today. They have lost it. Not that we can defeat Hamas militarily, we can't, and that should be obvious to everyone now 7 months into this war. We can only defeat Hamas politically, and here we have once again Netanyahu refusing to do that.
Gershon, I want to speak about Razi Hamid because there obviously was a relationship. He becomes the spokesperson, he gives the interview, and you become quite vocal about your relationship and your view after his interview in particular. Tell us about that.
I had spoken to Razi Hamid over the years more than 1,000 times. We met face to face 2 or 3 times. He was someone I continued negotiating with on behalf of Israel for the release of the bodies of 2 Israeli soldiers who were killed in 2014, Hagar Golden and Oron Shaul, and 2 Israeli civilians who were mentally not well and ended up in Gaza and being held captive in Gaza since 2014, Avera Mengistu and Hisham Asayed, an Ethiopian Israeli and a Bedouin Israeli. So Razi and I continued negotiating all the years, and we talked about everything from life and children and philosophy. And as a non-religious, as an atheist, I can say, he used to always joke with me and say, I'll pray for you. We had this kind of relationship where we talked about everything. And in the 3rd night of the war, I think it was, Israel bombed his house. And I contacted him and said, are you alive? And he answered. So I was relieved to know that he was alive. And I said, is it true they bombed your house? And he said, yes. And I asked him about his family, and he didn't answer. We started talking about what it would take to release hostages. I started already the 3rd or 4th night of the war talking about a release of the women, the children, the elderly, the sick, and the wounded. I had done research to find out how many women and teenage prisoners were in Israel. I found out their numbers. There were 39 women and 190 teenagers. I found out that none of them had killed Israelis. None of them were important Hamas people. None of them were from Gaza. They were all from East Jerusalem, mainly from the West Bank and a few from East Jerusalem. And I thought this was a deal that could easily be made. And I started talking to him about it. It was only 2 weeks later, I think, that I got a phone call from someone who used to be the advisor to Yasser Arafat on Hamas, who told me, Gershon, I ran into your old friend the other day. I said, where? I said, who are you talking about? He said, Razi Hamid. I said, where did you run into him? Are you in Gaza? He said, no, I'm in Beirut. And that was then that I discovered that Razi Hamid wasn't even in Gaza. I didn't know. He was talking to me that whole time, and I didn't know that he wasn't even at home. And for me, it was just so typical of the irresponsibility of the Hamas leadership, who were making decisions abroad that would bring about the death and destruction of the Gaza community of millions of people. And they were staying in hotels in places like Beirut and Istanbul and Doha. And I was really, really angry. And then there was that interview on Lebanese television where Hamas was still riding on the success, so to speak, of October 7th. And they believed that they were on the road to liberating Palestine. And Ghazi Hamad in that interview had said Israel has no moral right to exist. It needs to be erased from the map. And October 7th will happen again and again and again and again until we take back all of Palestine. And it was just infuriated me. And I wrote him a letter telling him how irresponsible it was that they did, the atrocities that they committed, the horrors of killing children in front of their parents and parents in front of their children and burning people alive and rape and you name it. I put it all in that letter. And I wrote that you lost the right to be someone who talks to me. That's how I felt. And after a few days of sitting on this letter that I sent him, and the interview that he gave got so much international attention, I decided to make it public. And it went viral all around the world. I think everyone in the world saw that letter. It was quite dramatic because many, many, many people knew of my so-called secret back channel with him over all these years. And people used to joke about my friend Ghazi Hamad. I will say that later I discovered that something like 17 members of his family were killed by Israel. And I think that might have been what was behind that interview in Lebanon. I don't forgive him for that. But I did contact him later and said that if being in contact with you, we can save human lives, then I'm willing to talk to you. And we have been communicating over the last months. I do it very carefully and I inform the officials when I contact him. I was hoping for the possibility of creating a secret direct back channel, but I was instructed by the Israeli negotiating team that they are not interested in a secret and direct channel with Hamas. They're happy to be negotiating through the Qataris and the Egyptians. Now I think mainly through the Egyptians. After today, the Israelis closed down the Al Jazeera offices in Israel, which is not going to make the Qataris very happy. But yeah, that's the story of me and Ghazi Hamad. I have spoken to other Hamas leaders. I've been in contact with 7 or 8 Hamas leaders, both in Gaza and in abroad, in Istanbul, in Beirut, and in Doha. It's very difficult. It's impossible to be in contact with the Hamas leadership in Gaza today. I have no way of contacting them and I haven't been in contact with them directly, except for one person who's no longer really in the leadership, but he was one of the founding members of Hamas, and we've communicated since the war has begun. My belief is that, I don't want to legitimize these people in any way, and I really think that they have no right to govern their people. I've believed for a very long time, for many, many years, that Hamas has to be a Palestinian problem, not an Israeli problem. That's what Arafat said to me once. That's what Mahmoud Abbas said to me many times. And other Palestinians, you Israelis need to make Hamas our problem. We will know how to deal with them when we have an alternative to offer to our people. But the more that Israel hits Hamas, the more it has grown powerful over the years. And I still believe very strongly there is no military defeat of Hamas, because Hamas is not just a government and an army, it's an idea and an ideology. And you don't defeat ideas and ideology militarily, you defeat them with better ideas and better ideology. And the better ideology that we have to use to defeat them is making the two-state solution real. Because that's the bottom line here, is we have 2 people living on this land, 7 million Israeli Jews, 7 million Palestinian Arabs between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and no one's going anywhere. And everyone living in the land between the river and the sea must have the same right to the same rights. Whether it's 1 state or 2 states or 10 states, that's another question. Suddenly, ironically, surprisingly, the two-state solution is back in front of us. After I thought it was dead for years, it's back in front of us. And now we have to make it real.
Gershon, given your understanding of Hamas, what do you think they actually intended to achieve on the 7th of October?
What I understand from talking to them and from reading what they talked about and what their instructions were, the troops, they sent 1,500 of their elite fighters. I started talking back in 2008 that Hamas is recruiting youngsters, children from bereaved families, from people who have lost their homes in wars with Israel. And they were recruiting them with their distorted view of Islam, that the greatest commandment, the greatest achievement that you can make is being a martyr for Palestine, a martyr for Allah. This is your duty. And while you're doing that, becoming a martyr, you're also going to get revenge for Israel killing, for the Jews killing your family. These are the kind of people that you cannot develop deterrence against. And this is one of the things that I've claimed in Israel against all the Israeli generals. I've sat on panels on television stations in Israel after every or during every war we've had with Hamas and heard all the generals repeat the mantra that we have to rebuild our deterrence. And I was the lone voice in the forest that said, you cannot create deterrence against people who believe it's their duty to die. There's no deterrence against that. What are you going to do? Threaten them? You're going to kill them? You're just fulfilling their wish. So this is who we're talking about. What they thought they were doing was sending 15,000 of their fighters into Israel. They expected 1,000 of them to be killed. They thought that 500 would succeed in capturing Israeli soldiers and taking them captive as hostages, and they would use them to free every single prisoner in Israel. Yahya Sinwar, when he was freed from prison in 2011, made a statement at the first public rally he spoke at that he would empty the Israeli prisons. He would free all the prisoners, all the people who he left behind, he would free. And he made that statement in every important speech he's given over the last years since he was freed. They never expected to find a border undefended. They never expected not to meet the Israeli army there. They never expected it to be so easy. In fact, one of the Hamas leaders said, if it was so easy, if we had known it was going to be so easy, we would have sent 10,000 people in and we would have conquered Tel Aviv. This is what they expected, but the Israeli army wasn't there. Because over the last decades, the Israeli Defense Force became the Israeli Occupation Police Force. They weren't trained to defend the borders. The borders were left defenseless. We built walls and fences and electronic surveillances and expected that that could stop an army. The army was in the West Bank protecting settlers over the Jewish holidays. They weren't on the border. So Hamas broke through. Using drones that you can buy on Amazon and hand grenades, they took out Israel's surveillance network. They were very well prepared and very well trained. They prepared this for 2 years. They knew how to take down Israel's communication network. They knew how to break through the walls and the fences. They knew how to dismantle the electronic surveillance. And 1,500 other Gazans from Islamic Jihad and just people coming in to pillage and to rape and to kill came over that day, and Israelis were defenseless. It was the most traumatic event in the history of Israel and the biggest trauma for Israelis and the Jewish people since the Holocaust. More Jews were killed in one place at one time than at any time since the Holocaust. And not only did we lose 1,200 people on that day and 240 taken hostages, we lost the belief that the state is here to protect us. We lost our sense of security. And we are still traumatized. Israel is living the trauma of October 7th. I have to say, without comparison, that since October 7th, the Palestinians are going through the Nakba of 1948. They are reliving the trauma of their catastrophe of 1948. And that's where they are. They don't see October 7th. We don't see beyond October 7th. We're looking at the same pictures and seeing very different realities. And our narratives have changed and been adapted to the realities that we live. And of course, the world is with the Palestinian narrative today because they don't see October 7th, or maybe they never even saw it. We haven't gone beyond October 7th in Israel. And I think Jews around the world are still reliving October 7th. I go everywhere with this yellow ribbon to remind me and people that we still have 132 hostages in Gaza. It's with us every single day.
Let's talk about those 132 hostages. What do we know? How many potentially could still be alive? And
We don't know.
Is there a deal possible to bring them out?
There's only one deal I believe possible to bring them out, and that's the end of the war, the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, and an enormous release of Palestinian prisoners, thousands, including most of the 559 who are serving life sentences for killing Israelis. That's the deal, probably the only deal. The negotiations that people were optimistic about in the last days broke down today. I wrote a tweet today that I think that what Hamas is demanding is that Netanyahu announce that the war is over. And this is clearly Hamas's desire to defeat Israel and defeat Netanyahu. It's personal. Of course, Netanyahu won't do that and won't say that, even though the war is essentially over. It's been over for months. They've been negotiating to bring home 33 of the hostages. I don't know why Israel would negotiate to bring home 33 of them and not all of them. But the requirement of Hamas, even for the 33, is to end the war. Netanyahu called that delusional. I don't find anything delusional about it, of Hamas wanting to end the war. What I find delusional is the fact that Israel has not put any plan forward of who takes over Gaza when Israel withdraws from it. In the situation where there is no alternative to Hamas, Hamas simply takes power again when Israel ends the war and withdraws from Gaza. And that's the catch-22 that we're stuck in. This is the impossible reality that we have created because Netanyahu refuses, because he's held hostage by his right-wing government. There must be a Palestinian, credible, legitimate group leadership that takes control of Gaza, that's willing to demilitarize, that's willing to engage in peace negotiations with Israel, that's willing to talk about redoing their educational system. Palestinians who believe that there is no armed struggle for the Palestinian people to achieve liberation. Palestinians who understand that in order for them to achieve freedom and dignity, Israel has to get security. But we in Israel have not yet learned and realized that in order for Israel to have security, Palestinians have to have freedom and dignity. And we won't have that as long as our current leadership is in power. And it's not only that the future has to be one without Hamas, it apparently has to be one without Abbas, because there is no Palestinian legitimate leadership with Hamas in power, with Abbas in power, because the Palestinians reject him. He's 89 years old in the 18th year of a 4-year term, and he's considered corrupt by almost every Palestinian in the world. They need new leaders, and we need new leaders. And we hopefully, I used in the first months of the war a metaphor, which I know is not completely appropriate, but I called it, we need the Belfast moment. What I called the Belfast moment, it's not what happened in Belfast actually, but there was a moment in a very long process in Northern Ireland where the people of Northern Ireland said no more. We've killed each other long enough. We've been in this battle, in the troubles for long enough. We need to look forward. And in our reality, we Israelis and we Palestinians are not going to forget what was done to us and what we've done to each other. And we've written a new chapter in our very sad narrative and collective memories. But we need a young generation that's going to begin not only looking backwards, but beginning to look forward as well, because we have to have a different future. And because this conflict is no longer limited to the river and the sea, it's gone beyond. It endangers the security of the region. It endangers global shipping. We saw in the night when Iran attacked Israel with hundreds of missiles that there was a regional defense pact that worked. Our neighbors protected us from Iranian missiles. And therefore, when we get beyond this war and bring the hostages home, we have to get back into the business of peacemaking with the international community playing a crucial role here. We can no longer accept another 30 years of talking about a two-state solution where the important countries of the world only recognize one of the states. Palestine must be recognized. Israel needs to be recognized by the whole world. There are 163 of the 193 member states of the United Nations that recognize Israel. There are 139 countries of the 193 that recognize Palestine. We need all the countries of the world to recognize both states. Palestine needs to become a member state of the United Nations, and we need to conduct negotiations in a regional framework that involves Israel and Palestine and Egypt and Jordan and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and we need the Saudis there. And the Palestinians have to have a credible, acceptable leadership to themselves, to Israel, to the United States, to the world. And there are people there who can do it. And we need new leaders in Israel.
So Gershon, I want to take a few questions from the audience, if you don't mind, and I want to talk about how we go forward. But you've also written 2 books, and I want to ask
I've written
Dylan
about
to.
I've written about a dozen books. They're all behind me here, but yeah, this is two of the famous ones.
2 of the famous ones. One is called The Negotiator. Can people get this on Amazon or Kindle?
I think it is on Amazon. There's an electronic version of it on Amazon, also for Kindle or for other platforms.
Is audiobook available at all?
This one, no. The second book is available as an audiobook as well. It was
So
published by
if we can ask
Vanderbilt.
Dylan to bring up the second book, please,
Right.
In Pursuit of Peace in Israel and Palestine.
Right. There's a
That
more up-to-date version of it in Hebrew. It was also translated and published in Arabic in Jordan and Lebanon. There's a Portuguese version of it published by the Jewish community in Brazil. And there's an audio and electronic version of this published by the Vanderbilt University Press in Nashville, Tennessee.
but
This book is 38 years of insights, lessons learned, what went wrong in the peace process, and how we could do it right.
I'd
With a lot of personal stories.
I certainly encourage everyone, but also on your website, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of op-ed pieces that you've written that I certainly encourage absolutely everyone. Is it GershonBaskin.com?
Or .org, yeah.
Or .org. So I certainly encourage everyone to go have a look and have a read. Thank you, Dylan. You can take that off the screen now. Gershon, there are questions coming in, one of which is about Ron Arad. Now, Ron Arad is an Israeli Air Force pilot who's been missing in, I think it's Syria or Lebanon for many decades now.
He's
Any
gone.
news? He's gone. They've never recovered a body.
No, never recovered a body. They never knew what happened. Negotiations were going on for his release. And basically, the negotiations ended because the people holding him, it was Amal, who was the more moderate Shiite movement in Lebanon, who were holding him at the time, demanded not only the release of prisoners, which was okay, but they also demanded $3 million in cash. And Prime Minister Rabin at the time refused to pay money for his exchange. When you think about it, it's just unbelievable. $3 million is what separated Ron Arad from coming back home alive. He was then transferred from Amal to someone else. They think maybe he was taken to Iran. They don't know. There was an Israeli Air Force attack against a building that they believe later maybe Ron Arad was in. They checked the building afterwards. They didn't find any of his DNA. He disappeared off the face of the earth. We never knew what happened to him.
I do encourage everyone, if you have a question, please pose it now. One of the questions that keeps coming up is that Netanyahu and the intelligence establishment in Israel seem to have warning signs that something was happening in Gaza and did nothing about it.
There were many warning signs, and there will be a National Commission of Inquiry founded when the war is over, headed by a Supreme Court judge, and everyone who had responsibility is going to be held accountable, starting with Netanyahu, who is the only person who refuses to take any responsibility. But there were testimonies from young women soldiers who sit on the border with the electronic surveillance, who were reporting strange things happening over on the Gaza side of the border. And their reports never made it up the chain of command, or if they did, they were ignored. Many people believed that they were ignored because they were coming from young women soldiers. Had there been young men soldiers reporting, it would have already been taken more seriously. But there were many other warnings and things that should have indicated that something was wrong. I don't have access to raw intelligence data, but those people who did, in hindsight, said, yeah, we knew this. A year before, a conference was held in Gaza under the title, The Final Promise. It's some distorted belief within Islam, a distortion of Islam, that there is a final promise of the day of Armageddon will come and everyone will become a Muslim, and those people who won't become Muslims will be killed. And they had a conference to plan this day that they said was happening. It was done in such detail that people were even given assignments to become the governor of Ashkelon and the governor of Kiryat Gat and the governor of Tel Aviv, and people were given tasks. That this was an actual plan, that Yahya Sinwar was directly behind. No one took it seriously.
Who in the Israeli establishment actually understands genuinely what's happening in the Palestinian community, how to solve these things, what's real, what's propaganda? Is there a genuine understanding?
There are people in the academia, a handful who do, I believe, who have a real sense. Most of our so-called experts in Arab affairs understand the Arabs by reading the media or watching their television and don't spend very much time talking to Arabs. This is one of the faults within our system. I've met so many experts on Palestinian affairs who tell me everything that Palestinians think and believe, but they never sit down and talk to Palestinians. There are people in the intelligence community who understand deeply what's going on. Often they don't speak their own minds until they're no longer in the service. It always amazed me how aware former security officers are as compared to how they were when they were in power. It's something within the military system, I think, that discourages people to voice opinions that are outside the norm or outside the conceptualization that people hold, even though one of the lessons of the failures of the Yom Kippur War back in 1973 was a direct encouragement of people, specifically junior officers, to speak their mind and have their voices heard, especially when they speak differently from what their commanders speak. But that was a long time ago already. And we went back to the system where the people on top know what they're talking about. We just had the head of military intelligence resign. He's the first domino piece to fall. Direct responsibility for the failure of not knowing what was happening in our backyard. But look, I ask the question all the time, how is it that Gilad Shalit was 5 years and 4 months in Gaza, not in Iran, not in Tehran, not in Damascus, not out in our backyard, and Israel never knew where he was?
You mentioned Iran now. Is Iran behind this? Are all of these forces pawns in a greater Iran scheme for
No,
Shia domination of the region?
no, Iran has spread its evil ideology around the region, but neither Hezbollah nor Hamas are puppets of Iran. One of the great failings of Yahya Sinwar and Hamas was that they thought that once they started this, that the whole region would attack Israel, and it didn't happen. They've encouraged it, and it hasn't happened. Iran has used its proxies, but even Hezbollah, which is a direct proxy, has fought Israel in a very limited way. They haven't waged a full-scale war, and they could have. But they're Lebanese, and they're protecting Lebanese interests. They will stop shooting at Israel the day that the war in Gaza ends. But we have to deal with the Lebanese border. That's a different issue. Iran remains a threat to Israel. But again, I said before, it's quite amazing that Iran, after all these decades of having a nuclear program, doesn't have a war, doesn't have a bomb. And I think it's because they have decided not to build a bomb. They could, if North Korea did it, if Pakistan did it. Iran is a very sophisticated country with lots of engineers and scientists. They could have certainly built a bomb by now if they had wanted to, but they haven't. It doesn't mean that they won't. They are at breakthrough. They can quickly assemble a nuclear weapon, but they haven't done it yet. They are a threat, which is really bizarre because there's no real conflict between Iran and Israel. I have a friend who was a stewardess on El Al, I think you call them a flight attendant these days. She was a stewardess back then in the 70s. She flew to Tehran 3 times a week. Israel built the Tehran airport. There were great relations. I think back when I was a university student in New York, I actually demonstrated against the Shah of Iran for his brutality to his own people. Boy, was that a mistake. We got after the Shah of Iran. But yeah, Iran is a problem, and Iran has its proxies, and they're all against Israel. Personally, I believe that if Israel were to manage to make peace with the Palestinian people, that we wouldn't see Iran's threats anymore as being there, that they would go away. Iran was one of the 56 members of the Conference of Islamic Countries that agreed to the Arab Peace Initiative that was issued in 2002, which said that if Israel withdraws from the territories it occupied in 67, allowed the Palestinians to have a state of their own with East Jerusalem as its capital and a just and agreed upon solution to the Palestinian refugee issue, all these countries, members of the Conference of Islamic States and the 22 countries of the Arab League, would make peace with Israel. Iran signed that.
So, Gershon, I want to talk about how we go forward from this in our last remaining moments of this. You spoke about the need that Hamas has lost the authority to be able to rule Gaza, that Abbas has lost authority to lead the Palestinians, that Netanyahu has to be removed from office, that we need a new version of leadership in the entire region. And you've spoken as well about the need of everyone to be recognized for a genuine two-state solution to go forward. How do we achieve this? What are the steps? What are the practical things that we do in order to move beyond where we are at the moment?
The sequencing of this is very difficult because we don't know who's going to take the first step. The international community led by the United States needs to recognize the state of Palestine, and Palestine needs to be granted membership in the United Nations. There's going to be another opportunity probably next month, again in the Security Council, and maybe the US won't veto it. I hope that they won't. Even if they abstain, it will go through and Palestine will be recognized and become a member state. That doesn't end the Israeli occupation, but it changes the parameters of the negotiations. The question of Palestinian statehood should not be under Israel's veto. This should be determined by the international community. And when we get to negotiations, the issue of statehood is not negotiated. It's the borders, it's the nature of sovereignty, it's economic relations, it's defense and security, water, environment, all these other issues. The Palestinians need to determine how they're going to create a new leadership. I know that the people in opposition to Mahmoud Abbas within the Fatah party are working on trying to create some kind of council that would be acceptable to people in the West Bank and Gaza and to the West and to Israel. There's a joker in the deck because the most popular Palestinian leader is Marwan Barghouti, who will probably be released in a prisoner deal with Hamas. And I have communicated with Marwan over the years through his lawyer. I know that he supports a two-state solution, but Marwan doesn't speak. And one of the reasons why he remains so popular is because he doesn't speak. And the moment he begins to speak, he'll probably lose popularity. But there is a figure who seems to be acceptable to the main political players in Palestine, not to Mahmoud Abbas, because he refuses to remove himself from power, but Mohammed Dakhlan, who is a very important player. He's in exile in Abu Dhabi. He's very important and very wealthy and responsible for about a third of the humanitarian aid entering in Gaza. And he has 10,000 people working for him in Gaza, distributing humanitarian aid to people, individual people, boxes of food and supplies. There's a figure named Nasser al-Qidwa. Dr. al-Qidwa was the PLO representative in the United Nations for about 18 years. He was foreign minister of the Palestinian Authority for a while. He's the nephew of Yasser Arafat. Nasser's mother was Arafat's sister, which gives him family credibility. He headed the Yasser Arafat Foundation until in May of 2021, when there were supposed to be parliamentary elections in Palestine that Mahmoud Abbas canceled. Nasser al-Qidwa was heading a joint list that was supported by Marwan Barghouti, and Mahmoud Abbas threw him out of Fatah and basically exiled him. He's living in Nice. 2 years ago, he went back to Gaza and opened up Arafat's in Gaza and started working from there. He has talked to Hamas people. Mohammed Dakhlan was in Doha a couple of months ago and met with Hamas people. What we understand is Hamas is willing not to govern anymore. They want to be integrated into some kind of government. They're willing to have a national unity government without any Hamas representation in it. The question is, what happens to the Hamas army? Mohammed Dakhlan's answer is that we integrate those people who are willing to accept our rule. We take away weapons from everyone. There will be no militarization in Gaza. The only people holding weapons will be an accepted Palestinian security force. We will work with the Israelis and the Americans and the world, and we will invite an Arab-led peacekeeping force to come into Gaza that will enable Israel to withdraw from Gaza. Only on condition of Israeli withdrawal from Gaza will the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Saudis, the Emiratis come in. They will be under a Palestinian invitation, not an occupation force. And they will be a peacekeeping force, which will, on the one hand, prevent Israel from going into Gaza, but it will also work with the Palestinian Security Force in taking away weapons from people in Hamas and Islamic Jihad, etc. This is all a grand scheme, and of course, there are a million bugs in it and things that could go wrong. But this is the talk that's going on behind the scenes now. It would be that Palestinian body that would work with the international community in raising the billions of dollars that need to go for reconstruction. And there are all kinds of ideas about reconstruction. Gaza needs to be rebuilt. And this time it won't be built with refugee camps. Refugee camps won't exist in Gaza anymore. People need to have decent housing and decent schools. One of the things that the Palestinians that I talk to have talked about is recognizing that they need to begin, or when we renew a peace process, it needs to begin with the issue of education and incitement, which was an afterthought in Oslo. But education is the best measure of any society. Look at what you teach your children. You know what a society wants and what it stands for, what its values are. And there's a recognition of these Palestinians who understand that there is no armed struggle anymore against Israel, that the only way to achieve liberation is by defeating Israeli fear, not by defeating Israel. One of my good friends, who's a member of this opposition body, says that we Palestinians have to recognize that the Jewish people have a connection to the land of Israel. They've always been here and they've always been connected to that land. But the Jewish people need to recognize that they were never here alone. There were always others in the land, and today we are the others. So this is a kind of agreement that both sides need to make of the mutual recognition of the existence of both people in this land. Dealing with education has to be done on both sides of the border. Israel needs to reform its education system. The Palestinians definitely need to do it. There can be agreed upon criteria, UNESCO criteria, other criteria, where each side evaluates its own educational system and proposes changes. It won't happen where we're evaluating each other's. There are a million different issues that we need to deal with, but the principles are set on what it means to have a two-state solution here. And that's how we need to move forward. A lot of moving pieces, a lot of things that can go wrong. The first and important thing is changing our leadership.
Gershon, my final question to you is, will we have peace in our lifetime?
Oh my God. If it's up to me, we will. Fortunately, it's not up to me. I have even a more difficult question that I'm facing with my own children. I have 3 children who were all born in Israel, who grew up in Israel, who were educated in Israel. My daughter has left Israel. She left 6.5 years ago with my granddaughter because she and her native-born Israeli husband decided that they didn't want to raise their children in this society, this militarized society. And they left. They live in the south of France. My 2 sons live here in Jerusalem. They're grown-ups. One is married and the other is living with his girlfriend. And one of my youngest son doesn't see a future here. Like many other young Israelis who are looking for places outside of Israel to find their future. And this pains me. My kids have asked me to put red lines down. When is Israel no longer my home? And I recently did it. And it pains me to think about it. One of the red lines was easy. If Itamar Ben-Gvir becomes prime minister of Israel, this is no longer a country I could live in. But the second red line pains me even more because it's maybe more possible. And that's if Benjamin Netanyahu is elected to be prime minister after everything that has happened on October 7th. If the people of Israel elect him again, this is not a country I can live in. I have no other home in the world. This is the only place I want to live in. Jerusalem is the only city in the world I want to live in. This is my home by choice. And it saddens me enormously to think about the possibility that this may be a place that I can no longer live in. And of course, that's connected to whether or not we will live in peace. I live in peace. I meet Palestinians and talk to Palestinians every day. Palestinians in Gaza, I'm still in communication with. Palestinians in the West Bank, Palestinians around the world. I go into Palestine, I meet people, I travel freely and without fear. I know that it's possible. I know that when you stretch out your hand in peace, it's generally received in peace. And that's what we have to learn. We have to replace our burning desire for revenge. And believe me, it's a very strong feeling. What they did to us, we want revenge. We need to replace that with compassion, which is really hard to do. We need to know that the victimhood that the Palestinians have been living for years, that we as Jews have lived with it for millennia. The greatness of Zionism was that we decided we would no longer be victims. We would take control of our destiny, of our history. And it's time for the Palestinians after October 7th to stand up and say, there is no armed struggle that we can win. We have to stop being victims. We have to take control of our destiny. And we have to verbalize our compassion toward the other people living in this land. My very good friend, Samer Sinjalawi, who was one of the Palestinian leaders of the opposition to Mahmoud Abbas, shortly after October 7th, went down to Kibbutz Kfar Aza, and he visited there. And there was Jason Greenblatt, the former advisor of Donald Trump, was there, and he was making a documentary film, and he asked Samer if he could be interviewed. And Samer was interviewed in this film and said, I came here to say, to witness what was done here in Kfar Aza, because even though I'm not Hamas, and I've never been Hamas and never support Hamas, this was done in my name, and I bear responsibility for it. So I came to pay my condolences to the victims of the people who were killed and taken hostage in Kfar Aza. And that was an enormously brave thing for him to do. He was attacked by fellow Palestinians, but he stood by it. He wrote about it. He wrote a big op-ed piece in the New York Times calling on Mahmoud Abbas to step aside. Very brave to do. But these are the kind of Palestinians that we need to see in positions of leadership. And Samer's a nationalist. He believes in Palestinian identity. He's a Jerusalemite who has lived in Jerusalem for generations, and he wants Palestine to be free. But he appears on Israeli media. He goes to Channel 14, that makes Fox television look peaceful. They want to interview me all the time. I won't go there. But Samer says, I need to talk to everyone in Israel. He often says to Israeli audiences, look, I know you better than you know yourselves because you don't talk to each other, and I talk to all of you, which is very true. So these are the kind of people that we need to reach our hands out to and accept their hands. And we need to position each other in positions of power and leadership. And we need to make it real.
Gershon, in the closing moments of this, I want to take literally the thousands and thousands of people who are still watching us this evening on YouTube, on Zoom, on Instagram, and on Facebook. I'm going to ask them just to take a moment and leave a comment. And maybe it's a bracha, maybe it's a blessing and a hope for peace. Because I think we've all been enormously traumatized by not only the events of the 7th of October, but what's happened in Gaza. We've been traumatized by the remarkable rise in anti-Semitism that we'd never believed in our own lifetime that we would see in our own lifetime. And I think Jews around the world, not just in Israel, are questioning whether they're safe, whether they're accepted, whether they have a home in the countries in which they live, Israel included.
Yeah, it's very frightening. I agree.
These are frightening times, but I want everyone just, if you would take a moment just to please leave us a message on whatever platform you're watching us this evening. And also to remind people that Yom HaZikaron started this evening. There are sirens that will wail in Israel to commemorate the Holocaust and the 6 million Jews who were massacred during the Holocaust. There are commemorative ceremonies in both Johannesburg and in Cape Town, and I'm going to please ask Dylan to post in all the chat sections if you'd like to attend one of the commemorations. tomorrow in Johannesburg or Cape Town, and there may even be in Durban as well. You can please pick up the details from the chat section as well. But as we say goodnight to everyone, if you can just leave us a message, and I'm going to, Gershon, as well, before I ask you to close, I'm going to send you copies of all of the comments from all of the viewers tonight, because I think we've engaged in a real meaningful and deep discussion. This hasn't been light and airy, and not everyone will agree with everything.
Sure.
And that's exactly what we want. But I think we've expanded
Even
the
my
conversation.
wife doesn't agree with me all the time, so it's okay.
but before you close, there was something when you were in South Africa that you told that deeply moved me, and I wonder if just before your closing moments you will tell the story, because we touched earlier on the release of the 1,027 hostage prisoners, and the fact that the people who killed your wife's cousin were released, and they did come to you. There was an emotional moment where they came to you because no one had consulted with them at all. They too were victims in all of this.
Yeah, I didn't actually meet the ones who had killed my wife's cousin. One of them, the person mainly responsible, was actually killed by Israel at the beginning of the war in Gaza. He had been exiled to Gaza. But there was, I don't know if this is the story I told you, but there was, in 1989, I rented my first office in East Jerusalem, right across from the Damascus Gate in the heart of East Jerusalem. And the office that I rented had been vacant for 3 years, and I didn't know why, but people told me after I had taken over the office, this was during the first Intifada, I was the only Israeli Jew in East Jerusalem in those days, but they had told me that the office was vacant because there was an Israeli woman had rented that office. She was a fixer. She helped Palestinians get licenses and permits. She was murdered in that office. I didn't know the story. I heard about it only after I took the office. One of the people who was released in the Shalit deal was the person who murdered her. And he approached me after he was released and wanted to meet with me. He didn't know that I rented that office, but he wanted to meet me and thanking me for helping get him released. And I had a meeting with him in East Jerusalem. I asked him in the course of our discussion, did he have any regrets? He said to me, I was a soldier taking orders. I did what they told me. I was acting on behalf of the Palestinian people in our cause for liberation. I don't have regrets. And I asked him, what about your children? He said, one of my daughter's a doctor and my son is a lawyer. I asked him, did you educate them to be part of the struggle? He said to me, only peacefully. And I thought that was telling of how from one generation to another, he spent, I don't know, 20 years in prison or more. He did not educate his children in the same way that he was educated. I later met the daughter of the woman who was murdered. She's a very famous Israeli television producer. I had asked her if she might be interested in talking to the person who killed her mother. I didn't expect that she would say yes, and she didn't. She wasn't interested. But she has very, very opinions that are very much like mine. Her mother was killed by a Palestinian who was released in the Shalit deal. She's one of the big critics of Netanyahu as well, and the failures of Israeli society over these times. There are all kinds of people and all kinds of stories, and of course, we're an accumulation of our life's experiences. I wanted to conclude by, you talked about Yom HaShoah, which began tonight. In a couple of weeks, we have Israeli Memorial Day and Israel Independence Day following the next day. There is every year for the last 14 years a joint memorial ceremony of Israelis and Palestinians led by two Israeli-Palestinian organizations, the Israeli-Palestinian Bereaved Families Forum and Combatants for Peace. And for 14 years now, they've been holding a joint Memorial Day ceremony, recognizing people who have been killed in this conflict and the importance of reconciliation. This year, because of the reality on the ground, they're not doing it in public. Last year was attended by thousands of people who will only be online. So if you look for the joint Israeli-Palestinian Memorial Day ceremony, you'll be able to watch it online. They are also combatants for peace, this joint Israeli-Palestinian organization of people who were combatants in this conflict, are also going to be doing on May 15th a joint Nakba ceremony. And they invite people around the world, Israelis and Palestinians and others around the world, to go online and also watch this ceremony. And I think this is part of the challenges that we face in recognizing the bereavement that we've gone through, the suffering, and looking at the narratives of the other side, not having to agree, but until we open up the window and begin to understand it, we'll never make peace. And as difficult as it is for Palestinians to look at Israeli Independence Day and try to understand why we're celebrating, it's difficult for Israelis to look at the Nakba ceremony and understand their trauma that they've been living through their whole lives. But it's something that's challenging and important to do, and it's a step that we need to do, as difficult it is to do. And I encourage everyone who's here this evening to participate in both ceremonies.
You know, we mentioned earlier Herb Kalman, who had taught me, and one of the things he taught me was about mirror imaging in conflict, of how each side often perceives the other as intransigent, of unsympathetic, and they view each other in almost identical ways. Yeah. And if you break that mirror and realize that you're dealing with humans on the other side, suddenly you can start unraveling the conflicts that you see. I think probably the most beautiful thing tonight was Carol, who posted a comment and said, "How will we sleep this evening?" Gershon Baskin, you've been so generous with your time. I'm so appreciative. We've had an enormous audience. And as you've seen from the numbers have kept on going up. And in the weeks and months to come, of course, on YouTube and Instagram and Facebook, we will get hundreds of thousands of views to this evening. So thank you so much.
Send me the links and I will share them as well widely in my social media.
Fantastic. Good night to everyone. If you still want to leave us a comment, please do so. Don't forget, on the 19th, we are doing South African elections. Please join us for that. We've got some very difficult decisions to make. Gershon, thank you. Enormous respect for your time and your contribution to the Jewish people and to Israel. Thank you and good night.
Good night.